In the autumn of 2028, in the quiet, rolling heart of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, the soybean harvest was a collective prayer that went unanswered. Field after field of brittle, yellowing stalks stood under a gray sky, their pods thin and underdeveloped, many of them empty. The air, which should have been thick with the rumble of combines and the dusty perfume of threshed beans, was still. Men in their 50s and 60s, men who had farmed this land their entire lives, stood at the edges of their fields with their hands on their hips, their faces grim. The official county average, a number that would later be cited in academic papers and government reports, was 14.2 bushels per acre, a figure so low it felt like a judgment. It was a catastrophic failure, a silent agricultural heart attack. But one farm, a 220-acre plot on Umber Road, was an island. There, the combines ran from dawn until dusk. The air was filled with the sounds of a successful harvest. The yield monitor in the cab of the John Deere S780, a machine operated by a 30-year-old man named Jacob Miller, consistently flickered between 110 and 115. The final certified yield for the Miller farm, delivered in a sealed envelope from the grain elevator, was 112.7 bushels per acre. The difference between ruin and prosperity, between 14 and 112, was not the seed variety, which was the same Pioneer P28A42X everyone else had planted. It was not the fertilizer, the soil pH, or the amount of rainfall. The difference was a 4.7-mile-long, 12-foot-wide, century-old tangle of Osage orange, black cherry, elderberry, and wild rose that bordered every field. The difference was the hedgerows that everyone else, in the name of progress, had ripped from the earth. To understand how this happened, you have to go back. Not just to the preceding spring, but back a decade, back a century, back to the very idea of the farm itself. Let me tell you about the deed, because the story begins there. The deed to the Miller farm was not a modern document printed on 8.5 by 11-inch paper. It was a heavy linen-based parchment folded into eighths and kept in a hinged tin box that had once held German biscuits. The calligraphy, written in 1888, was ornate but faded. It documented the sale of 220 acres from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to one Elias Mueller, a German immigrant who had arrived with $40, a Bible, and the profound distrust of open spaces. Elias was 32 years old, had been a farmer in the Palatinate region of Germany for 16 years, and was known for a habit of staring at the horizon as if expecting an enemy to appear. The land he bought was good, rich Lancaster soil, but it had been cleared indiscriminately. It was a blank slate, and this emptiness unsettled him. In Germany, fields were small, contained. They were bordered by ancient stone walls, by thickets of hawthorn and hazel, by lines of trees that served as windbreaks, property markers, and pantries. These borders, these Hecken, were not wasted space. They were integral organs of the farm's body. They slowed the wind, held the soil, harbored birds that ate insects, and provided wood for the fire and berries for jams. A field without a border to Elias Mueller was like a house without walls. It was vulnerable. So he began to build his walls, not with stone, but with life. He spent his first winter walking the perimeter of his new land and then crisscrossing it, dividing the 220 acres into a patchwork of smaller, manageable fields, none larger than 30 acres. Along these lines he planted. He chose Osage orange, Maclura pomifera, for his primary fence line. The settlers called it hedge apple. Its wood was dense, yellow, and resistant to rot. Its branches were thorny and interlocking, forming a barrier that was, as he wrote to his brother back in Germany, pig-tight, horse-high, and bull-strong. It was a living barbed wire, a fence that repaired itself. But a fence was not enough. A fence keeps things out. Elias wanted something that also kept things in. So, into the Osage orange, he wove other things. He planted black cherry for its fine wood and for the birds it would attract. He planted elderberry, whose flowers his wife Anna would make into cordial, and whose berries she would turn into winter medicine. He planted wild roses, not for their beauty, but for their hips, which were packed with vitamin C. He encouraged the volunteers, the milkweed that fed the monarch butterfly, the goldenrod and aster that bloomed late in the fall, providing the last source of nectar for the bees before winter. He built not a fence, but a linear ecosystem, a living repository. It took him 10 years to establish the full 4.7 miles of it. His neighbors, mostly English and Scots-Irish, thought him peculiar. Their fields were vast and open, their fences made of split rails that rotted and needed constant mending. Elias's farm looked cluttered, old-world, inefficient. They did not understand that he was not just farming acres. He was building a fortress of resilience. This knowledge, this philosophy, was passed down. Elias's son, Samuel, inherited the farm in 1927. He maintained the hedgerows, pruning them in the winter with the same long-handled shears his father had brought from Germany. He taught his son, Silas, born in 1954, how to read the hedgerows. "Look," he'd say, pointing to a profusion of elderberries, "a wet spring. The ground is happy." Or he'd point to the thickness of the wild grapevines. "A hard winter is coming. The hedge is putting on its coat." To them, the hedgerows were not a nuisance. They were a barometer, a calendar, a living chronicle of the land's history and health. Silas Miller, at age 74 in the year of the harvest, was a man carved from the same wood. He had farmed the 220 acres for 58 years, since he was 16. He was known for his quiet demeanor and for wearing the same style of gray work shirt every day. He moved slowly, deliberately, as if conserving a finite amount of energy. His hands were thick and calloused, but they were gentle with a sick calf or a struggling seedling. He still kept the 1888 deed in the tin box, alongside a hand-drawn map his grandfather Samuel had made in 1940, showing every tree and significant shrub in the 4.7-mile network. To Silas, the map and the land were one and the same. He had never considered removing the hedgerows any more than he would consider removing his own lungs. They were, to him, essential. This view was not shared by his grandson. Jacob Miller was 24 years old in 2018. He was bright, ambitious, and held a degree in agribusiness from Penn State, earned with a 3.8 GPA. He loved his grandfather, but he viewed the farm through the lens of spreadsheets, efficiency metrics, and satellite yield maps. He saw the hedgerows not as a living system, but as 8.5 acres of unproductive land. 8.5 acres that could be growing soybeans at $10 a bushel. That was, in a good year, another $47,600 in gross revenue. He saw the winding 30-acre fields as an obstacle to the new, larger equipment that promised unparalleled efficiency. The farm's 20-year-old John Deere 9650 combine had a 30-foot grain head. The new models had 50-foot heads, but they couldn't turn easily in Silas's small, hedge-lined fields. Jacob saw the farm not as a legacy to be preserved, but as an asset to be maximized. And he was not alone. The world was coming to agree with him. The change arrived in a cloud of dust behind a white Ford F-150 in the spring of 2018. The truck belonged to a man named Mark Renslow. Renslow was 38 years old, had been a regional sales director for Agri Solutions for 6 years, and was known for his firm handshake and his unshakable confidence in data. He wore a clean blue polo shirt with the Agri Solutions logo embroidered on the chest. He carried an iPad, and he believed, with the sincerity of a missionary, that he was helping farmers. He was not a villain. He was worse. He was a well-meaning man with a simple, powerful, and incomplete idea. He organized a meeting at the township hall. It was a Tuesday night in April. About 50 farmers showed up, Silas among them, Jacob at his side. They were men in flannel shirts and muddy boots, their faces lined by the sun and by worry over commodity prices. Renslow stood at the front of the room, a large screen behind him displaying the Agri Solutions logo. He was fluent in the language of modern agriculture. He spoke of economies of scale, of maximizing input efficiency, of leveraging technology to de-risk operations. "Folks," he began, his voice radiating a calm authority, "we're in a new era. The margins are tighter than ever. The global marketplace is more competitive than ever. We can't afford to farm like our grandfathers did." He clicked a button on a remote. A satellite image of Lancaster County appeared on the screen. A patchwork of green and brown. Red lines highlighted the thousands of miles of hedgerows and tree lines that still crisscrossed the landscape. "This," he said, gesturing to the red lines, "is your single greatest untapped asset. We call it shadow acreage. It's land you own that you pay taxes on, but that isn't generating a single dollar of revenue. Worse, it's actively costing you money." He switched to a new slide filled with charts and numbers. "Our data shows that the average hedgerow reduces yield in the first 15 feet of an adjacent field due to root competition and shading. It harbors pests and diseases, and most critically, it limits the efficiency of your equipment. A modern GPS-guided combine operates at 95% efficiency in a 100-acre field. In a 30-acre field, with tight turns and obstacles, that efficiency drops to 78%. You are burning fuel and losing time, and time is money." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. Jacob was leaning forward, nodding. Silas sat motionless, his hands resting on his knees. Then came the offer. Renslow called it the Field Consolidation and Modernization Grant, a program sponsored by Agri Solutions in partnership with the USDA. The deal was simple. Agri Solutions would pay for the complete removal of the hedgerows, the bulldozers, the backhoes, the wood chippers. They would even pay to have the new, larger fields laser leveled. In exchange, the farmer would sign a 5-year agreement to purchase Agri Solutions seed and their proprietary herbicide blend. And on top of that, each participating farmer would receive a one-time cash payment of $5,000. "We're not asking you to spend a dime," Renslow said, his voice earnest.
We are investing in you. We are paying you to unlock the full potential of your own land. We project an average yield increase of 8 to 10% in the first year alone, simply from the added acreage and improved equipment efficiency. The room was buzzing.
Men who had been struggling with debt, with stubbornly low corn prices, saw a lifeline. It wasn't just the money, it was the promise of control, of modernity. It was a way to fight back against the feeling of being left behind. A farmer named Tom Henderson, who owned the 300 acres bordering Silas to the west, stood up. "So you're saying you'll pay me $5,000, clear out those damn thorny hedges my dad was always fighting with, and I'll get more beans out of the deal?" "That's the data, Tom," Renslow said with a confident smile. "The data is clear." The questions continued for an hour. They were practical, logistical. No one questioned the underlying premise. No one asked what else the Hedgerows might be doing. The conversation was about dollars and bushels, about efficiency and yield. Finally, Silas Miller stood up. The room quieted. Silas rarely spoke at public meetings. He was 70 years old then. He didn't look at Renslow. He looked at his neighbors. His voice was low, raspy. "That hedge on my western line, Tom," he said, nodding to Henderson. "My grandfather planted that with yours in 1905 after the big wind that took the roof off your barn. It's a windbreak." He turned his gaze to another farmer. "The one on the south side. It holds the soil on that slope. Before that was there, every spring 2 inches of my topsoil washed into your bottom field." He finally looked at Renslow. His eyes were clear, steady. "There's more work happening in that fence than your data shows, Mr. Renslow. You're measuring what's easy to measure. The corn, the beans. You're not measuring the quiet things." Renslow maintained his professional smile. "I respect your perspective, Silas. Truly. The heritage of these farms is important. But we have to be realistic. This is about economic viability. We're talking about unlocking 8.5 acres on your farm alone. That's a significant financial uplift. The land isn't working for you right now. It's locked." Silas shook his head slowly. He delivered his final line so quietly, people had to strain to hear it. It wasn't an argument. It was a statement of fact, as he saw it. That land isn't locked, Mr. Renslow. It's working. It's just working on a different kind of job. He sat down. The moment passed. The allure of the data, of the cash, of progress, was too strong. By the end of the meeting, 28 of the 50 farmers in the room had signed up. Over the next 6 months, nearly every farm in the township followed suit. The bulldozers arrived that summer. They were huge yellow machines, caterpillars and komatsus that tore into the earth with an astonishing violence. A century of growth, of intricate, interlocking life, was ripped out in an afternoon. Great pyres of Osage orange, cherry, and elderberry were burned, the smoke hanging over the valley for weeks. The sound of chainsaws and grinders filled the air from dawn to dusk. What was left was a raw, open landscape. The small, contained fields merged into vast, unbroken plains of brown soil, stretching from road to road. The farmers stood and watched, a sense of awe and unease mixed on their faces. It looked clean, efficient, modern. It looked like progress. Jacob watched it all with a sense of frustrated excitement. He argued with his grandfather in the evenings, sitting at the old oak kitchen table. He brought out his textbooks, his spreadsheets. "Granddad, look at the Hendersons' numbers. They've already done their fall planting in half the time it took us. They bought a new Case 1H Steiger, a 600 horsepower tractor. We can't compete with that. We're falling behind. Silas would listen patiently, sipping his coffee. He never raised his voice. We're not in a race, Jacob. We're in a relay. You have to have something left to hand off. What good is handing something off if it's bankrupt? Jacob shot back, his voice rising. That's what's going to happen. We're being sentimental about a bunch of thorny bushes. It's the thorns that are the point, Silas said quietly. They protect the soft things inside. For the first few years, Jacob's fears seemed justified, and Silas's wisdom looked like foolish nostalgia. The new consolidated fields were undeniably efficient. The big, GPS-guided machines planted perfectly straight rows, applying seed and fertilizer with computer-controlled precision. Tom Henderson's first soybean harvest after the clearing yielded 72 bushels per acre, 10 more than he'd ever gotten before. The numbers, as Renslow had promised, were clear. The farmers used their profits and the Agri-Solutions grant money to invest in even bigger equipment. The valley floor was soon dominated by massive red and green machines moving across immense, fenceless fields like ships at sea. The Miller farm, with its patchwork of hedgerows, looked like an anachronism, a museum piece. Tourists driving through the countryside would sometimes stop to take pictures of it, remarking how quaint it looked compared to the vast, industrial-scale farms surrounding it. Jacob felt a hot flush of embarrassment every time he saw them. His grandfather's farm was becoming a novelty. But Silas kept to his rhythms. In the winter, he pruned the hedgerows, clearing out the dead wood, ensuring sunlight could reach the understory. In the spring, he watched the mason bees emerge from their nests in the hollow stems of last year's flowers. In the summer, he'd walk the lines and see the bumblebees, fat and slow, buzzing among the milkweed and the clover that grew in the unmowed margins. He saw the kestrels and hawks perched on the high branches of the cherry trees, hunting for mice and voles in the fields. He saw the garter snakes sunning themselves on the lower branches. He saw a world of quiet work being done, a world that was invisible to the satellite yield monitors and the Agri-Solutions spreadsheets. Let me tell you about the bees, because they are central to this story. Not just the honeybee, Apis mellifera, the European import that had become the backbone of American agriculture. The story is about the other ones, the 4,000 species of native wild bees in North America. The ones who don't live in hives, who don't make honey for humans, who had been doing the work of pollination for millennia, quietly and for free. There are the bumblebees, who perform a special kind of buzz pollination, essential for crops like tomatoes and peppers. There are the tiny sweat bees, the metallic green ones that glint in the sun. There are the mason bees, who live solitary lives in tunnels in wood or stems, and are far more efficient pollinators, bee for bee, than the honeybee. These native bees need a specific kind of habitat. They need undisturbed soil to nest in. They need pithy stems from last year's growth. They need a continuous succession of different flowers from early spring to late fall, not just a single crop that blooms for 3 weeks. They need, in short, exactly what a hedgerow provides, a messy, diverse, permanent tangle of life. The problem began subtly around 2022. It was a story that played out in the background of the news, a low hum of anxiety beneath the louder noise of politics and the economy. A new, particularly virulent strain of the varroa mite, a parasite that feeds on honeybees, had emerged in Asia and was spreading rapidly. It was resistant to most common treatments. At the same time, A new class of systemic pesticides, heralded for their efficiency, was coming into widespread use. These pesticides were absorbed into every part of the plant, nectar and pollen included. The combination was devastating. By 2024, the term colony collapse disorder 2.0 was common. Beekeepers were reporting winter losses of 70%, 80%, even 90%. The cost of renting commercial hives for pollination, a standard practice for crops like almonds and apples, began to skyrocket. For soybean farmers in Lancaster County, it was a distant problem. Soybeans are considered self-pollinating. They don't technically require an insect to move pollen. But self-pollinating is not the same as optimally pollinating. Decades of research had shown that insect pollination, even in self-pollinating crops, dramatically increased pod set, seed weight, and overall yield. A soybean field visited by bees could produce 15 to 20% more than one that wasn't. For years, this service had been provided for free by a mix of managed honeybees and wild pollinators. The farmers had taken it for granted, like the sun and the rain. In 2026, the cost of renting a single honeybee hive for the 3-week soybean bloom, which had been $80 a decade earlier, hit $400. Most farmers, their margins already thin, decided to gamble. They'd rely on the wild bees and hope for the best. But in the vast, clean, fenceless fields of Lancaster County, the wild bees were gone. The hedgerows, their homes, their pantries, their nurseries, had been burned. The landscape was a monoculture desert, a green carpet for 3 months, and a brown desert for the rest of the year. There was nothing for them to eat before the soybeans bloomed, and nothing for them to eat after. There was nowhere for them to nest. The fields fell silent. Silas noticed it first. Walking his hedgerows in the summer of 2027, he saw a concentration of life that felt almost supernatural. The air hummed. The flowers of the elderberry and the wild rose were thick with a dozen different kinds of bees and flies. It was noisy. Then he would walk to the edge of his property and look out over Tom Henderson's immaculate, weed-free field of soybeans. It was vast, green, and perfectly uniform. And it was silent. There was no hum, no buzz, just the whisper of the wind over the leaves. Jacob saw it too, but he saw it in the data. He was flying a drone over their fields, checking crop health with a multispectral camera. When he looked at the images from his neighbors' farms, he saw subtle variations in color that indicated stress. His own fields were a uniform, deep green. He started reading the scientific papers coming out of Penn State and Cornell about the pollinator crisis. He read about the critical role of natural habitat corridors in preserving native bee populations. The papers were filled with phrases like ecosystem services, biodiversity, and agricultural resilience. They were scientific terms for the things his grandfather had been talking about for years. He started to feel a growing dread. The spring of 2028 was beautiful. The weather was perfect. Ample rain followed by long, sunny days. It should have been a banner year. The soybean plants grew tall and lush across the county. But as the purple flowers opened in July, the second part of the equation was missing. The pollinators didn't arrive because they were no longer there to arrive. The flowers opened, waited, and then withered, unvisited. Pods failed to form. The ones that did form had only 1 or 2 beans inside, instead of the usual 3 or 4. By September, the truth was undeniable. The fields were a disaster. Tom Henderson, who had been so proud of his efficiency, walked into his field and pulled 100 pods at random. He shelled them by hand, his face growing tighter with each empty shell. His yield, he calculated, would be lucky to hit 20 bushels an acre. He was facing foreclosure. He wasn't alone. The entire community was in a state of shock, staring at the ruin of their own making. The decisive moment came on a cold, damp evening in November of 2028. An emergency meeting was called at the same township hall where Mark Renslow had made his confident presentation a decade earlier. The mood, this time, was not hopeful. It was angry, desperate, and confused. The same 50 farmers were there, but they were 10 years older, their faces etched with a decade of hard work that had led to this. Mark Renslow was there too. He had driven up from corporate headquarters in St. Louis. He looked uncomfortable in his expensive suit. He tried to explain the failure with data on unusual weather patterns and a suspected soil nutrient deficiency. No one was buying it. Finally, the county extension agent, a young woman named Sarah Chen, stood up. She had the official certified yield reports from the grain elevators. Her job was to read them. She held the paper in her hand, and her voice was flat, devoid of emotion. She read through the list of names, farm by farm. Henderson, Thomas, 18.4 bushels per acre. A groan went through the room. Eberly, John, 12.1 bushels per acre. Groff, Samuel, 21.9 bushels per acre. On and on it went. The numbers were a litany of failure. 15, 19, 11, 24. Each number landed like a blow. The farmers sat slumped in their chairs, staring at the floor. It was a public accounting of a private catastrophe. Then she got to the M's. Jacob was sitting in the back, his stomach in a knot. His grandfather was at home. He had refused to come. "There's nothing to say," he'd told Jacob. "The work is done. The numbers will speak for themselves." Sarah Chen cleared her throat. She seemed to hesitate for a fraction of a second, as if to make sure the number was real. Miller, Silas. The room was completely silent. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. 112.7 bushels per acre. The number hung in the air. It was so far outside the realm of possibility, so utterly alien to the reality of everyone else in that room, that for a moment, nobody reacted. They were trying to process it. 112.7. It wasn't just a success. It was a miracle. A rebuke. Then a low murmur started. Heads turned. People were looking back at Jacob, their faces a mixture of disbelief, envy, and the dawning, terrible understanding. Tom Henderson, his face ashen, just stared at Jacob, his eyes asking a question he couldn't bring himself to speak. Mark Renslow stood at the front of the room, his iPad hanging uselessly at his side. His data had nothing to say in the face of that number. His entire system, his philosophy of efficiency and optimization, had been invalidated by a single, quiet fact. In the silence, Jacob Miller felt the weight of 4 generations settle on his shoulders. He didn't feel triumph. He felt a profound and humbling reverence. The aftermath was quiet, as Lancaster County things often are. There were no grand apologies, no dramatic confrontations. There was just a slow, painful, and necessary turning. The following spring, Tom Henderson appeared at the edge of the Miller farm. He stood there for a long time, looking at the thick, thorny wall of the hedgerow that separated his barren land from Silas's. Silas came out of the barn and walked over to him. They stood for a moment, not speaking. "Silas," Henderson finally said, his voice thick, "my great-grandfather helped yours plant this. I was wondering if you'd have any saplings, if you'd show me how to start again." Silas just nodded. "The roots are the hardest part," he said. "They take the longest." Over the next few years, the Hedgerows began to return to Lancaster County, not with the help of a government grant or a corporate program, but neighbor by neighbor, farmer by farmer. They came to Silas for Osage orange cuttings, for elderberry saplings, for seeds of milkweed and aster he had collected and saved in small paper bags. Jacob, now 30, worked alongside his grandfather, teaching the other farmers, sharing the knowledge he had once dismissed as sentiment. He put his agribusiness degree to a new use, calculating the long-term economic value of ecosystem services, creating charts that showed how a 12-foot wide strip of unproductive land could be the most valuable part of a farm. Mark Renslow was quietly transferred to a desk job in the corporate office. A year later, AgriSolutions, in a stunning display of corporate adaptation, launched a new initiative. It was called the Biodiversity Enhancement Grant. It paid farmers to plant native grasses and wildflowers along the borders of their fields. It was heralded in press releases as a visionary step toward sustainable agriculture. They were selling the cure for a disease they had helped create. On a cool evening in the fall, a few years after the silent harvest, Silas and Jacob were walking the western hedgerow. The sun was setting, casting a golden light over the fields. The air was alive with the hum of insects and the calls of birds settling in for the night. Silas was 80 years old now, and he moved more slowly, but his eyes were still sharp. He stopped and pointed to a small, thorny sapling barely a foot high that Jacob had planted a few months earlier. "It's not just a line on a map, Jacob," Silas said, his voice the same quiet rasp. He had said it to Jacob 100 times before, but now the words carried the weight of vindication. "It's a lung. It breathes for the land." Jacob nodded. He finally understood. He was not just inheriting 220 acres of soil. He was inheriting a system, a relationship, a form of wisdom that operated on a timescale longer than a single growing season or a quarterly earnings report. It was a wisdom that knew that the things that look like waste are often the sources of wealth, that resilience is more important than efficiency, and that the quiet, unmeasured work is often the work that matters most. What is rigid breaks. What is optimized for a single perfect scenario is fragile. It is the messy, complex, inefficient, and diverse system that survives the shock. The farm that thrives is not the one that has eliminated every variable, but the one that has embraced them. It understands that the margin is not a source of loss, but a source of life. The hedgerow does not just protect the field. It is the field's memory. It is its immune system. It is its future.